I've been putting off writing this for 3 years now. 3 years of sleepless nights, of jumping at shadows, of checking my locks twice before bed. 3 years of telling myself it was all just some fucked up nightmare, that what happened at the Holloway Institute wasn't real. But I can't keep lying to myself anymore. Not after what I found last week. Let me start from the beginning, though. Back when I still thought the worst thing that could happen to me was getting caught trespassing by some bored security guard. It was October 2021, and I was back home in Millbrook, Pennsylvania for the first time in almost 2 years. COVID had pretty much killed any chance of visiting during college, and honestly, I wasn't in any rush to come back to this dead-end town anyway. But my mom had been bugging me about Thanksgiving, and my girlfriend Jessica had broken up with me the month before, so I figured why not spend a few weeks wallowing in my childhood bedroom. I was grabbing coffee at Mel's Diner on Main Street when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Holy shit, is that Danny Brennan? I turned around and there was Marcus Webb, grinning at me like we were still 17 and sneaking beers behind the football bleachers. Marcus had been my best friend all through high school, along with our buddies Tyler and Sarah. We called ourselves the Millbrook Misfits. Yeah, I know, super original, and we'd spent most of our teenage years exploring every abandoned building, forgotten tunnel, and supposedly haunted location within a 50-mile radius. Marcus, you son of a bitch, I said, standing up to give him a hug. What the hell are you doing here? I thought you moved to Pittsburgh after graduation. I did, but I'm back for a few weeks helping my dad with a hardware store, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. Business has been shit since Home Depot opened up in the next town over. What about you? Still at Penn State. Graduated last spring, I said. Haven't figured out what I'm doing with my life yet, so I'm back home being a disappointment to my parents. Marcus laughed. Dude, join the club. I've got a degree in communications and I'm stocking paint cans. Living the dream. We spent the next hour catching up, and it felt good to talk to someone who remembered what it was like before everything got so complicated. Before college, before jobs, before the real world started grinding us down. Hey, speaking of the old days, Marcus said, leaning forward with that mischievous look I remembered so well. You hear what happened to the Holloway Institute? I shook my head. The Holloway Institute was this massive psychiatric hospital that had been built in the 1920s on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned since the late 80s when the state shut it down amid scandals about patient abuse and medical malpractice. Growing up, we'd always talked about exploring it, but the place was surrounded by a 10-foot fence and patrolled by security guards. Plus, all the entrances had been sealed up with concrete blocks. They're tearing it down next month, Marcus continued. The county finally sold the land to some developer who's going to build condos or some shit. But here's the kicker. They fired the security company last week to save money. The place is completely unguarded for the first time in decades. I felt that familiar rush of excitement, the same feeling I used to get when Marcus would tell us about some new place he'd found for us to explore. No way. Are you thinking what I think you're thinking? I'm thinking this is our last chance to see inside that place, he said. I already called Tyler and Sarah. They're both back in town too. Sarah's working at her mom's real estate office, and Tyler's doing some kind of IT thing remotely. They're both in if you are. I hesitated for a moment. We weren't kids anymore. We were adults with responsibilities and reputations to protect. But then I thought about Jessica, about my non-existent job prospects, about sitting in my childhood bedroom for the next 3 weeks watching Netflix and feeling sorry for myself. Fuck it, I said. I'm in. Marcus's grin got even wider. I was hoping you'd say that. Sarah's been doing research on the place, and apparently there are some seriously messed up stories about what went on there. This is gonna be epic. We agreed to meet up at Sarah's place that evening to plan everything out. As I walked back to my car, I felt more alive than I had in months. Maybe it was stupid, maybe we were too old for this kind of thing, but I didn't care. For the first time since graduation, I had something to look forward to. Sarah lived in a small apartment above her mom's real estate office on Elm Street. When I knocked on the door that evening, she answered wearing an oversized Penn State sweatshirt and had her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked exactly the same as she had in high school, except for the tired circles under her green eyes. Danny, she squealed, throwing her arms around me. Oh my God, it's so good to see you. Sarah had always been the heart of our group. She was the one who kept us all together, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who talked us out of doing truly stupid shit while still being game for adventure. She'd been planning to be a veterinarian, but from what Marcus had told me, she dropped out of college after her dad died in a car accident her sophomore year. Tyler was already there, sprawled on Sarah's couch with a laptop balanced on his knees. He looked up and nodded at me. "Hey man, good to see you." Tyler had always been the quiet one, the tech guy who could hack into school systems and disable security cameras. He'd grown his hair out and had a beard now, but he still had that same intense look in his dark eyes. "All right, gang's all here," Marcus said, rubbing his hands together. "Sarah, show Danny what you found." Sarah grabbed a thick folder from her coffee table and sat down next to me. "Okay, so I've been digging into the history of the Holloway Institute, and holy shit, Danny, this place is seriously fucked up." She opened the folder and pulled out a stack of photocopied newspaper articles. It was built in 1923 by Dr. Edmund Holloway, who was apparently some kind of pioneer in experimental psychiatric treatment. But look at this. She handed me an article from the Millbrook Herald dated 1956. The headline read, "Mysterious Deaths at Holloway Institute Spark Investigation." Between 1950 and 1970, over 200 patients died at the institute under suspicious circumstances, Sarah continued. The official cause was usually listed as suicide or natural causes, but several former employees came forward claiming they witnessed brutal experiments, unauthorized surgeries, and torture disguised as treatment. Tyler looked up from his laptop. "I've been digging through old state records, and there are reports of patients being subjected to electroshock therapy without anesthesia, being kept in isolation for months at a time, and being given experimental drugs that were never approved for human testing." "It gets worse," Sarah said, pulling out another article. In 1963, a night janitor named Robert Mills claimed he saw Dr. Holloway and several other staff members performing some kind of ritual in the basement. He said they were chanting in a language he'd never heard before, and there was a patient strapped to a table in the middle of it all. Mills went to the police, but Dr. Holloway had connections all the way up to the state capitol. Mills was found dead in his apartment 3 days later, apparent suicide. I felt a chill run down my spine. Jesus Christ, Sarah. This place sounds like a horror movie. "That's not even the worst part," she said. Dr. Holloway himself disappeared in 1973. Just vanished one night, along with several other staff members. They found his office completely trashed, with strange symbols drawn on the walls and what looked like blood. The institute was shut down by the state in 1987, but not before dozens more suspicious deaths. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "So what do you guys think? Still want to check it out?" I looked around at my friends. Tyler was already pulling up building schematics on his laptop. Sarah was organizing her research with the same methodical approach she'd always used for school projects. Marcus was grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "When do we go?" I asked. "Tomorrow night," Marcus said. "It's supposed to rain, which means less chance of anyone seeing us. Plus, it's a Thursday, so the town will be pretty dead." Tyler turned his laptop around to show us a detailed floor plan of the institute. I found the original architectural plans in the county records. The place is huge, 4 stories plus a basement level. There are multiple wings, administration, patient housing, medical facilities, and something labeled special treatment in the basement. "Special treatment?" Sarah asked. "That sounds ominous." "Probably where they did the really fucked up shit," Marcus said. "Which means that's definitely where we need to go." I studied the floor plan, trying to memorize the layout. The building was shaped like a cross, with a central hub and 4 wings extending out from it. The basement level was particularly complex, with a maze of small rooms and corridors. "How do we get in?" I asked. "I thought all the entrances were sealed up." Tyler zoomed in on the eastern wing. "There's a service entrance here that leads to the old kitchen. According to the records, it was only blocked with plywood instead of concrete. I drove by earlier today, and it looks like the wood is pretty rotted. We should be able to pry it open without too much trouble." "What about equipment?" Sarah asked. "Flashlights, cameras, that kind of thing." "I've got us covered," Marcus said. "My dad's got a whole collection of camping gear in the store. Headlamps, portable lights, first aid kit, even a couple of walkie-talkies in case we get separated." "Good thinking," I said. "What about timing? How long do we stay?" "I'm thinking 2 to 3 hours," Marcus replied. "Long enough to explore the main areas, but not so long that we're there when the sun comes up. In and out, quick and clean." Sarah closed her folder and looked at each of us seriously. "Before we do this, I want to make sure everyone understands what we might be getting into. This isn't just some abandoned factory or empty school. People died in that place. Really horrible deaths. And if even half of what I've read is true, there might be, I don't know, bad energy or something. You mean like ghosts? Tyler asked skeptically. I mean like whatever drove Dr. Holloway and his staff to do the things they did might still be there, Sarah said. Look, I know it sounds crazy, but I've been having dreams about that place ever since Marcus told me we were going. Really vivid dreams where I'm walking through dark corridors and hearing people screaming. Marcus rolled his eyes. Come on, Sarah. You're psyching yourself out. It's just an old building. Yeah, some bad shit happened there, but that doesn't mean it's haunted or cursed or whatever. Maybe, Sarah said. But I still think we should be careful. If anything feels wrong, if any of us gets a bad vibe, we leave immediately. No questions asked. We all agreed to that. Looking back now, I wish we'd taken Sarah's concerns more seriously. I wish we'd listened to that little voice in the back of our heads telling us that some places are abandoned for good reason. But we were young and stupid and convinced that we were invincible. We shook hands on it like we were signing some kind of pact, and spent the rest of the evening going over our plan until we knew it by heart. 24 hours later, we were standing in the parking lot of a closed gas station about half a mile from the Holloway Institute, loading up our backpacks and trying to pretend we weren't nervous as hell. The rain had started just after sunset, a steady drizzle that made everything look gray and miserable. Tyler had brought a pair of bolt cutters for the fence, and Marcus had packed enough lighting equipment to illuminate a small stadium. Sarah had printed out copies of the floor plans for everyone, and I brought my old digital camera to document everything. All right, team, Marcus said, shouldering his pack. Last chance to back out. Anyone having second thoughts? Nobody said anything, but I could see the tension in everyone's faces. Sarah kept checking and rechecking her equipment. Tyler was unusually quiet, and even Marcus seemed a little less confident than usual. Okay then, Marcus continued. Let's go make some history. We walked along the tree line for about 10 minutes, until we reached the fence surrounding the Institute grounds. The place was even more imposing than I'd remembered from driving past it as a kid. The main building loomed against the cloudy sky like some kind of Gothic cathedral, its broken windows staring down at us like empty eye sockets. Tyler made quick work of the chain-link fence, cutting a hole just big enough for us to squeeze through. The service entrance was exactly where the plan said it would be, hidden behind a cluster of overgrown bushes on the east side of the building. Marcus pulled out a crowbar and went to work on the plywood covering the door. The wood was so rotted that it practically fell apart in his hands. Within minutes, we were staring into the pitch-black interior of the Holloway Institute. Well, Sarah said quietly, I guess this is it. I clicked on my headlamp and took a deep breath. The air coming out of the building smelled like mold and decay, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something sweet and sick that made my stomach turn. Stay close, Marcus said. And remember, if anyone gets spooked, we all leave together. With that, we stepped across the threshold and into the darkness. The first thing that hit us was the silence. Not just quiet, but a complete absence of sound that seemed to press against our eardrums. Our footsteps echoed weirdly in the empty space, and I could hear everyone's breathing like it was being amplified. We were in what had once been the kitchen, though most of the equipment had been removed decades ago. Industrial sinks lined one wall, and there were metal prep tables scattered around the room. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. Jesus, Tyler whispered. This place is huge. He was right. Even with our headlamps, we could barely make out the far walls of the room. According to the floor plan, the kitchen was just one small part of the eastern wing. Where do we start? Sarah asked, her voice sounding small in the vast space. Marcus consulted his copy of the building plans. Let's head to the central hub first, get our bearings. Then we can decide which wing to explore. We made our way carefully through the kitchen and into a long corridor that stretched toward the center of the building. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti left by previous trespassers. Most of it was the usual stuff, names, dates, crude drawings, but some of the messages were more disturbing. Get out while you still can was spray painted in red letters near the ceiling. The doctor is still here was scrawled in what looked like charcoal. They're watching from the walls was scratched directly into the plaster with something sharp. Cheerful, Sarah muttered, taking pictures of the graffiti with her phone. As we walked deeper into the building, I started to notice that the temperature was dropping. By the time we reached the central hub, a large circular room with corridors branching off in 4 directions, our breath was visible in the beam of our flashlights. "Is it just me? Or is it getting really cold in here?" Tyler asked, zipping up his jacket. "Old buildings lose heat fast," Marcus said, though he was shivering too. "Plus, it's raining outside." The central hub had probably been a reception area back when the institute was operational. There was a curved reception desk in the center of the room, and the walls were lined with empty picture frames and bulletin boards. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its wooden banister worn smooth by decades of hands. But what really caught our attention was the mural painted on the ceiling. Even in the dim light of our headlamps, we could see it was a depiction of what looked like a medical procedure. Doctors in white coats surrounded a patient on an operating table, but there was something wrong with the scene. The doctors' faces were too long, their smiles too wide, and their hands ended in what looked like claws instead of fingers. "What the fuck is that supposed to be?" Tyler asked, aiming his light directly at the ceiling. Sarah consulted her research notes. According to the records, Dr. Holloway commissioned that mural in 1955. He called it the Healing Arts. The hospital board tried to have it removed several times, but Holloway always blocked them. I was studying the mural more closely when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the painting, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a small figure. It was a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, strapped to a table, while one of the demon doctors leaned over them with a surgical instrument. "Guys," I said quietly, "look at this." They gathered around me as I pointed out the hidden figure. Sarah gasped and took a step back. "Oh my God," she whispered. They were experimenting on children. That's when we heard it, a sound coming from somewhere deeper in the building. It was faint at first, just barely audible over the sound of rain on the roof. But as we stood there in silence, it got louder. It sounded like crying. A child crying. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. We all nodded. The sound was coming from the northern wing, the section labeled patient housing on our floor plans. "It's probably just the wind," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Old buildings make all kinds of weird noises." The crying continued for another minute or so, then abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. "Maybe we should start with a different wing," Tyler suggested. "The administration section or medical facilities." But Marcus was already walking toward the northern corridor. "Are you kidding me? This is exactly the kind of thing we came here for. Besides, it's probably just some homeless person who's been squatting here." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Marcus, wait. I really don't think we should dash." "Come on, Sarah," he said, gently pulling free. "We've explored dozens of places like this. When have we ever encountered anything actually dangerous?" I wanted to point out that we'd never explored a place with a history quite like this one, but Marcus was already heading down the corridor. Tyler shrugged and followed him, leaving Sarah and me alone in the central hub. "Danny," Sarah said quietly, "I have a really bad feeling about this." "I know," I said, "but we can't just leave them. Come on, let's catch up. We'll stick together, and if anything feels wrong, we'll get out of here." Sarah nodded reluctantly, and we hurried after our friends. The northern wing was laid out like a typical hospital corridor, with patient rooms branching off on both sides. Most of the doors were standing open, revealing small windowless cells that had probably once held the institute's most troubled patients. The rooms were empty now except for the occasional piece of abandoned furniture, a metal bed frame here, a broken chair there. About halfway down the corridor, we caught up with Marcus and Tyler. They were standing outside one of the rooms, their lights focused on something inside. "What is it?" Sarah asked. Marcus stepped aside to let us see. The room was different from the others. Instead of being empty, it was filled with children's drawings. Hundreds of them, covering every inch of the walls. They were crude, the kind of artwork you'd expect from a 6 or 7-year-old, but the subject matter was deeply disturbing. Most of the drawings showed the same thing, stick figures in white coats standing over smaller stick figures on tables. In some pictures, the small figures were crying, their mouths drawn as perfect circles of distress. In others, they appeared to be screaming, their bodies contorted in positions that suggested extreme pain. "Jesus Christ," Tyler whispered. "What kind of sick fuck would make kids draw this stuff?" Sarah was taking pictures with her phone, tears streaming down her face. "These aren't drawings the kids were made to do," she said. These are their way of trying to process what was being done to them. I studied the drawings more closely and noticed that many of them were signed with children's names: Tommy, Susan, Billy, Jenny. At the bottom of each drawing was a date, all from the 1960s. Look at this, Marcus said, pointing to one drawing near the back corner of the room. It showed a much more detailed scene than the others. A man in a white coat, presumably Dr. Holloway, was standing over a child on an operating table. But surrounding them were other figures, shadowy shapes with glowing eyes. And in the background, barely visible, was what looked like some kind of altar or shrine. The drawing was signed Michael, age 7 to 1963, and underneath, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "The doctor talks to the shadow people." "Fuck this," Tyler said, backing away from the wall. "This is seriously messed up. We need to document this and get it to the authorities." "The authorities have known about this place for decades," Sarah said bitterly. "They shut it down and sealed it up and hoped everyone would forget about it. Just like they always do." That's when we heard the crying again. This time it was much closer, coming from somewhere further down the corridor. And it wasn't just one child, it sounded like several children, all crying at once. "Okay," Marcus said, his voice a little shaky now. "That's definitely not the wind." We stood there in silence, listening to the heart-wrenching sound of children in distress. It went on for several minutes, rising and falling like some kind of horrible chorus. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. "That's it," Sarah declared. "I'm done. We're leaving. Right now." But before any of us could move, we heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the far end of the corridor. And they were getting closer. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing off the walls with a steady, measured rhythm. Step, step, step. Like someone taking their time in no hurry at all. "Turn off the lights," Tyler whispered urgently. We clicked off our headlamps in unison, plunging the corridor into absolute darkness. The footsteps continued, and now I could hear something else, a soft humming, like someone singing a lullaby under their breath. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness, her palm slick with sweat. Marcus was breathing heavily beside me, and I could smell his fierce sweat mixing with the musty air of the old building. The footsteps stopped directly outside the room we were hiding in. The humming continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to an elderly woman, we heard, "Children should be in bed by now. It's past lights out." None of us dared to breathe. The voice had a strange quality to it, like it was coming from very far away, even though the speaker was right outside our door. "I know you're there, little ones," the voice continued, sing-song and sweet. Come out, come out. Dr. Holloway wants to see you." I felt Sarah's grip on my hand tighten to the point where her nails were digging into my skin. Marcus made the smallest sound, barely a whimper, and I wanted to tell him to shut up, but I was too terrified to make any noise at all. The footsteps started again, moving past our room and continuing down the corridor. We waited in the darkness, listening as they grew fainter and fainter until they finally disappeared entirely. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Marcus clicked his headlamp back on, the sudden light making all of us squint and blink. "What the fuck was that?" he whispered. "We need to leave," Sarah said firmly. "Right now. I don't care what that was, a vagrant, some crazy person, I don't care. We're leaving." "Wait," Tyler said, holding up his hand. "Did you guys notice anything weird about those footsteps?" "You mean besides the fact that they belong to someone who shouldn't be here?" I asked. "No, I mean the sound," Tyler insisted. "They were too loud, too sharp, like they were wearing hard-soled shoes, not sneakers or boots. Who wears dress shoes to squat in an abandoned building?" He was right. Now that I thought about it, the footsteps had sounded like someone wearing the kind of shoes a doctor might wear. Professional shoes. Hospital shoes. "Maybe it's security," Marcus suggested. "Maybe they didn't fire all the guards." "Security guards don't hum lullabies and talk about Dr. Holloway like he's still alive," Sarah said. "That person, whoever they were, was seriously disturbed. We need to get out of here before they come back." I was inclined to agree with her, but as we prepared to leave the room, Tyler grabbed my arm. "Danny, look at this." He was shining his light on the wall next to the door, on a section we hadn't examined before. Among all the children's drawings was something different, a message written in what looked like crayon, but in an adult's handwriting. Dr. Holloway is in the basement. He's been waiting so long for new subjects. The children miss their medicine. Below that, in the same adult handwriting, room B12. Come find us. We have such wonderful things to show you. Okay, that's it, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. We're leaving right fucking now. But Marcus was studying the message with that same excited expression he'd always gotten when we found something interesting during our explorations. Guys, think about this, he said. What if that person we heard wasn't some random squatter? What if they're connected to the Institute somehow? A former patient, or maybe even a former staff member? Marcus, no, Sarah said. Whatever's going on here, we don't want any part of it. But this could be the story of a lifetime, Marcus continued. Think about it, we could be the ones to finally expose what really happened here. We could get justice for all those kids. Or we could end up as the next victims, I said. Marcus, I love you like a brother, but Sarah's right. This is getting way too intense. Tyler was quiet for a moment, then looked up from his phone. I just tried to call 911, but I'm not getting any signal. That's weird. I had full bars when we were outside. We all checked our phones. Tyler was right. None of us had any signal at all. Cell towers can be spotty out here, Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. Or something's jamming the signal, Tyler suggested. Some kind of electronic interference. Sarah was already heading for the door. I don't care why we can't call for help. I just want to get out of here. We gathered our gear and prepared to leave the room, but as we stepped into the corridor, we heard something that made us all freeze. Children's laughter. It was coming from multiple directions, ahead of us, behind us, from the rooms on either side. Happy, innocent laughter, like kids playing during recess. But there was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. What the hell? Marcus whispered. The laughter continued for about a minute, then gradually faded away. In the silence that followed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Guys, I said quietly, look at the floor. I shined my light down at the dusty linoleum. There, clearly visible in the beam, were small footprints. Child-sized footprints, dozens of them, leading in all directions throughout the corridor. But the footprints weren't dusty like everything else in the building. They looked fresh, like they'd been made recently. Those weren't there before, Tyler said, his voice shaking. I know they weren't there before. Sarah was backing away from the footprints, shaking her head. This isn't real. This can't be real. That's when we heard the voice again, but this time it was closer. Much closer. Time for your examination, children. Please report to the medical wing. The voice was coming from right behind us. We spun around, our lights cutting through the darkness, but there was nobody there. Just the empty corridors stretching back toward the central hub. Run, Sarah whispered. Then louder, run. We took off down the corridor, our footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow space. Behind us, I could hear other footsteps, multiple sets, all running in the same direction we were. But when I looked back, there was nobody there. We reached the central hub and stopped to catch our breath. The mural on the ceiling seemed to leer down at us, those demonic doctors with their impossible smiles. Which way? Marcus panted. Kitchen, Sarah said. Back the way we came. But as we started toward the eastern wing, all the lights went out. Not our headlamps, those were still working. But somewhere in the building, lights had been turned on, and now they were all switching off at once. We could see the illumination fading from windows in the other wings, like someone was going room by room, methodically extinguishing every light source. How is there electricity in this place? Tyler asked. It's been abandoned for decades. Maybe they never shut off the power, Marcus suggested. Or maybe someone turned it back on. The building fell back into darkness, except for our headlamps. But now we could hear something else, the sound of machinery starting up. Old, mechanical sounds like elevators and ventilation systems coming online. The building's waking up, Sarah whispered, and I realized that was exactly what it sounded like. Like the Institute was awakening after a long sleep. That's when we heard the intercom crackle to life. Attention, patients, came a man's voice, authoritative and clinical. It's time for evening medication. Please report to the nurse's station for your treatments. The voice was coming from speakers throughout the building, echoing off the walls and creating a surreal chorus of overlapping announcements. All children are to return to their rooms immediately. Lights out is in 15 minutes. Dr. Holloway will be making his rounds shortly. Please have your treatment charts ready. Remember, patience, compliance is the key to recovery. Resistance will be met with corrective measures. The announcements continued for several minutes, each one more disturbing than the last. They spoke of treatments and procedures, of experimental therapies and corrective surgeries. They mentioned patients by name: Tommy, Susan, Billy, Jen, the same names we'd seen on the children's drawings. And through it all, we could hear other sounds: doors slamming, footsteps in distant corridors, the squeak of gurneys being wheeled across floors. "This is impossible," Tyler said. "The Institute has been empty for 40 years. There's nobody here." But even as he said it, we could see lights beginning to flicker on in the windows of the other wings. Not electric lights, these had a different quality, like candlelight or oil lamps. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Right now." We started toward the eastern wing again, but stopped when we saw that the corridor we'd entered through was now blocked. Not by a physical barrier, but by a group of figures standing silently in the shadows. They were small, child-sized, wearing what looked like hospital gowns. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but I could see their eyes bright, reflecting the light from our headlamps like animals' eyes. "Hello," one of them said in a voice that sounded hollow and far away. "Are you here for treatment?" "We're new patients," said another. "Dr. Holloway says we'll be here forever. He makes us better," said a third. "Better and better and better." Sarah let out a small sob and grabbed my arm. "Danny, please. Please get us out of here." I looked around desperately, trying to find another way out. The western wing led to the administrative offices, the southern wing to the medical facilities. Both were glowing with that strange, flickering light. "The stairs," Marcus said suddenly. "We go up to the second floor, find another way down." It wasn't a great plan, but it was better than trying to get past the children blocking our exit. We headed for the grand staircase, our footsteps echoing on the wooden steps. The second floor was laid out similarly to the first, with a central hub and corridors leading to different wings. But this level felt different, more oppressive somehow, like the air itself was thicker. And everywhere we looked, there were more signs of recent activity. Doors that had been closed were now standing open. Lights flickered in distant rooms. We could hear voices, conversations, the sound of people moving around just out of sight. "This way," Tyler said, pointing toward what looked like another staircase at the far end of the western wing. We made our way carefully down the corridor, passing rooms that had obviously been offices back when the Institute was operational. Unlike the patient rooms downstairs, these still contained furniture, desks, filing cabinets, bookshelves filled with medical texts. In one office, I noticed that there were papers scattered across the desk, as if someone had been working there recently. I stopped to look closer and felt my heart skip a beat. They were patient files, dozens of them, all dated from the 1960s. But the ink looked fresh, like they'd just been written. "Danny, come on," Marcus called from ahead. I hurried to catch up, but as we passed another office, something caught my eye. There was a nameplate on the door, Dr. Edmund Holloway, Chief of Psychiatry. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see light coming from inside. Not the flickering candlelight from the other rooms, but steady, bright illumination like a desk lamp. "Guys," I said softly, "look at this." They gathered around me as I pointed to the nameplate. Through the crack in the door, we could see part of the office interior. There was a desk with papers neatly arranged on it, bookshelves lined with medical journals, and what looked like a coat hanging on a hook behind the door. "Someone's been using this office," Sarah whispered. As if summoned by her words, we heard the sound of footsteps approaching from inside the room. Slow, measured steps, like someone walking around the desk. The door began to open. "Move," Marcus hissed, and we all scrambled toward the staircase at the end of the hall. Behind us, I heard the office door swing fully open, followed by that same elderly woman's voice we'd heard earlier. "Children, is that you? Come back here this instant. The doctor will be very disappointed if you're late for your appointment." We reached the staircase and started down, taking the steps two at a time. This staircase was narrower than the grand staircase in the central hub, and it led directly to the basement level. "Wait," Sarah said as we reached the bottom. "This isn't the way out. We're going deeper into the building." She was right. According to the floor plans, we were now in the basement level, in what had been labeled as the special treatment area. The basement was different from the upper floors. The walls were concrete instead of plaster, and the ceiling was lower, giving the whole space a claustrophobic feel. The air was colder down here, and there was a strange smell, antiseptic mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant. There should be another staircase that leads back up to the kitchen, Tyler said, consulting his copy of the floor plan. We just need to find it. The basement was laid out like a maze, with narrow corridors branching off in all directions. Most of the rooms were small, windowless spaces that had probably been used for storage or mechanical equipment. But some were larger, and through the open doorways, we could see the remnants of what had once been medical facilities. Operating rooms with rusted surgical tables. Examination rooms with stirrups and restraint still bolted to the walls. And in one particularly disturbing room, what looked like a primitive electric shock therapy setup, complete with leather straps and metal electrodes. Jesus Christ, Marcus muttered, shining his light around the shock therapy room. They really did torture people down here. That's when we heard it, a sound that made all of us freeze in terror. Screaming. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the basement, echoing off the concrete walls. Not just one voice, but multiple voices, all screaming at once. Men, women, children, all crying out in agony. The screaming went on for what felt like forever, then gradually faded to a series of sobs and whimpers. We need to find that staircase, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. Right now. We continued through the maze of corridors, checking each room for another way up. The screaming had stopped, but now we could hear other sounds, the buzz of electrical equipment, the squeak of metal on metal, and underneath it all, a low chanting in a language I didn't recognize. There, Tyler said, pointing to a corridor that seemed to lead back toward the center of the building. The staircase should be that way. We started down the corridor, but stopped when we saw light spilling out from one of the rooms ahead. Bright, clinical light like the kind you'd find in a modern hospital. Room B12, Marcus said, reading a sign on the door. That's the room mentioned in the message upstairs. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself walking toward the light. It was like being drawn by some invisible force, unable to resist the pull. Through the open doorway, I could see into the room. It was set up like an operating theater, with surgical table in the center surrounded by bright lights. Medical instruments gleamed on rolling carts, and monitors displayed vital signs for patients who weren't there. But what made me stop breathing was what I saw standing around the operating table. They looked like doctors and nurses, wearing white coats and surgical masks. But there was something wrong with them, something that made my mind recoil from what I was seeing. They were too tall, their limbs too long, and they moved with a fluid, inhuman grace. And they were all looking directly at us. "Welcome," one of them said in a voice that sounded like rustling leaves. "We've been waiting for you." "Such perfect specimens," said another, tilting its head at an impossible angle. "The doctor will be so pleased." That's when I saw him. Dr. Edmund Holloway, standing at the head of the operating table. He looked exactly like the photos in Sarah's research, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes. Except those eyes were now completely black, like pools of oil, and when he smiled, I could see that his teeth had been filed to sharp points. Our new patients have arrived," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the concrete room. "Right on time for the evening procedure." The other figures began moving toward us, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by a drunk puppeteer. That's when the spell broke, and we ran. We sprinted back down the corridor, the sound of pursuit echoing behind us. But it wasn't footsteps we heard. It was something else, something that sounded like scuttling, like multiple legs moving across the concrete floor. "There," Sarah shouted, pointing to a staircase at the end of a side corridor. We took the stairs 3 at a time, bursting through a door at the top and finding ourselves back in the kitchen where we'd started. The service entrance was still open, rain still falling outside, and I had never been so happy to see anything in my life. We ran for the opening, but just as we reached it, the door slammed shut. And that's when we heard Dr. Holloway's voice, coming from right behind us. Now, children. The treatment hasn't even begun." We spun around to face Dr. Holloway, our headlamps cutting through the darkness of the kitchen. But he wasn't there. The space behind us was empty, filled only with the shadows cast by rusted equipment and overturned tables. "Where the fuck is he?" Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, we heard that horrible scuttling sound again, coming from multiple directions now. It was in the walls, in the ceiling, moving all around us like some kind of massive insect colony. Tyler threw himself against the service door, pushing with everything he had. "It won't budge," he grunted. It's like it's welded shut. Sarah was frantically checking her phone again. Still no signal. Danny, try the door. I joined Tyler, both of us putting our shoulders against the plywood that had been so easy to remove just hours before. It didn't move even a millimeter. The wood felt solid as concrete, like it had been there for decades. The windows, Marcus said, pointing to a row of high, narrow windows near the ceiling. We can break one of those. But even as he spoke, we could see that the windows were different now. What had been broken glass when we entered was now solid, unbroken panes that gleamed like they'd just been installed. This is impossible, Sarah said, her voice rising toward hysteria. Buildings don't just repair themselves. That's when the lights came on. Not electric lights, something else entirely. A soft pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, like the building was alive and breathing. In that eerie illumination, we could see that the kitchen had changed. The rusted equipment was now clean and functional, humming with electrical current. The overturned tables were upright, their surfaces spotless. Steam rose from industrial-sized pots on the massive stove, and I could smell something cooking, something that made my stomach turn. "What's for dinner tonight, children?" came a cheerful voice from behind us. We turned to see a woman in a stained apron standing by the stove. She looked like she belonged in a 1950s cookbook, with perfectly curled hair and bright red lipstick. But her smile was too wide, stretching literally from ear to ear, and her eyes were the same oil-black voids we'd seen in Dr. Holloway. "We're having a special treat," she continued, stirring one of the pots with a ladle that looked suspiciously like a surgical instrument. "Brain soup. It's the doctor's favorite recipe." "Run," Tyler whispered. The corridor. We backed toward the door leading deeper into the building, but stopped when we saw what was waiting for us there. Children. Dozens of them, all wearing hospital gowns, all staring at us with those same black eyes. They ranged in age from maybe 5 to 15, and they were all smiling the same impossible smile as the cook. "New friends," one of them exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "We haven't had new friends in so long. The doctor says you're going to stay with us forever," said a boy who couldn't have been older than 8. "Isn't that wonderful? We'll show you all our favorite games," added a girl with pigtails. "Hide and seek in the morgue. Surgery with the shadow people. Pin the tail on the lobotomy patient." The children began moving toward us, their movements just as unnatural and jerky as the doctors we'd seen in the basement. Some of them were missing limbs, arms, legs, even heads in a few cases, but they kept moving anyway, guided by some invisible force. "The pantry," Sarah whispered, pointing to a small door near the back of the kitchen. "Maybe there's another way out." We squeezed through the narrow doorway into what had once been a food storage area. Shelves lined the walls, but instead of canned goods, they were filled with glass jars containing things I didn't want to look at too closely. Floating specimens that might have once been organs. Or worse. There was another door at the back of the pantry, and Tyler immediately started working on the handle. "It's locked," he said, "but I think I can pick it." While Tyler worked on the lock, the rest of us kept watch. Through the pantry door, we could see the children filing into the kitchen, spreading out to search for us. The cook was still stirring her pot, humming some old lullaby under her breath. "How long?" Marcus asked. "Almost got it," Tyler replied, his fingers working frantically with a paperclip he'd found in his pocket. "Just a few more seconds." That's when one of the children spotted us. "There they are," she shrieked, pointing directly at the pantry door. "They're hiding with the specimen jars." The entire group turned toward us, their faces lighting up with that horrible, too-wide smile. "Found you," they called out in unison, their voices creating a disturbing harmony. "Ready or not, here we come." "Tyler," Sarah hissed. "Got it." The lock clicked open just as the first child reached the pantry door. We tumbled through into another corridor, this one unfamiliar from our floor plans. The walls here were lined with what looked like school lockers, each one bearing a child's name and a number. "This way," Marcus said, choosing a direction at random. We ran down the corridor, passing locker after locker. Some of them were standing open, revealing small personal belongings, toys, drawings, pieces of clothing. All of it looked like it had been there for decades, but somehow perfectly preserved. Behind us, we could hear the children giving chase, their bare feet slapping against the linoleum floor. But there was something else mixed in with the sound of their footsteps, that same scuttling noise we'd heard before, like insects or spiders moving in the walls. Here, Sarah called out, pointing to a door marked gymnasium. We burst through the door and found ourselves in a large, open space that had probably once been used for recreational activities. Basketball hoops hung from the ceiling, and there were gymnastics mats scattered across the floor. But like everything else in this nightmare place, it had been transformed into something sinister. The mats were stained with what looked like dried blood, arranged in strange patterns that reminded me of ritual circles. The basketball hoops had been fitted with nooses instead of nets, and several of them were occupied by small, still figures. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed. What did they do to these kids? But we didn't have time to investigate. The children from the kitchen were already streaming through the door behind us, followed by others we hadn't seen before. There had to be at least 50 of them now, all with those same black eyes and impossible smiles. The other door, Tyler said, pointing to the far end of the gymnasium. We ran across the open space, dodging around the blood-stained mats, and trying not to look at the figures hanging from the basketball hoops. The children followed, but they weren't running. They were moving with that same jerky, unnatural gait, like they were being controlled by something else. The door at the far end led to another corridor, this one lined with classrooms. Through the windows, we could see more children sitting at desks, all of them writing in notebooks with the same mechanical precision. What are they writing? Sarah asked, slowing down to peer through one of the windows. I looked too, and felt my blood run cold. Every child in the classroom was writing the same thing, over and over again. I will be a good patient. I will take my medicine. I will not resist treatment. The words filled page after page, written in perfect, identical handwriting. We need to keep moving, I said, pulling Sarah away from the window. But as we continued down the corridor, I noticed that the children in the classrooms were beginning to look up from their writing. One by one, they turned to stare at us through the windows, their black eyes tracking our movement. Then, in perfect unison, they all stood up and began walking toward the classroom doors. Shit, Marcus muttered, quickening his pace. The classroom doors began opening, and children started filing out into the corridor. They didn't say anything, just fell into step behind us, adding to the growing crowd of our pursuers. At the end of the corridor was a set of double doors marked auditorium. We pushed through and found ourselves in a large theater-style room with rows of seats facing a stage. The stage itself was lit by a single spotlight, and standing in the center of that light was Dr. Holloway. He looked different now, more solid, more real than the glimpse we'd caught in the basement. He was wearing a pristine white coat over a dark suit, and his silver hair was perfectly combed. If it weren't for those oil-black eyes and pointed teeth, he might have looked like any distinguished physician. "Welcome, my dear patients," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium without any amplification. "Please take a seat. We have so much to discuss." We stopped at the back of the auditorium, trapped between Dr. Holloway on the stage and the growing crowd of children behind us. There had to be over 100 of them now, filling the corridor and spilling into the auditorium. "You've been very difficult to catch," Dr. Holloway continued, walking to the edge of the stage. "Most of our patients are much more compliant. But I suppose that's what makes you special. What do you want from us?" Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the large space. Dr. Holloway smiled, and I could see every one of those needle-sharp teeth. "The same thing I've always wanted, my dear. To help, to heal, to make you better." "You're dead," Marcus said. "You disappeared in 1973. This isn't real." "Death is such a limiting concept," Dr. Holloway replied. "I prefer to think of it as a transition. A graduation, if you will, from one state of being to another." He gestured to the children surrounding us. "All my patients have graduated, in one way or another. Some through my medical procedures, others through more traditional means. But they all remain here, in this place, continuing their treatment." "You're talking about the kids you murdered," I said, anger overriding my fear for a moment. Dr. Holloway's expression didn't change. "I prefer the term therapeutic intervention. You see, these children were sick, damaged. Their minds were broken, their spirits corrupted by the outside world. I simply helped them transcend their earthly limitations." "You're fucking insane," Tyler said. "Sanity is another limiting concept," Dr. Holloway replied. "What you call madness, I call enlightenment. And soon you'll understand." He raised his hand, and the children behind us began moving forward, slowly but steadily pushing us toward the stage. "Now then," Dr. Holloway said, let's discuss your treatment options. I have several procedures in mind that I think will be perfect for each of you." He pointed at Tyler. "You have such an analytical mind. I think a prefrontal lobotomy would be perfect for quieting all those troublesome thoughts." Tyler went pale and started backing away, but there was nowhere to go. Dr. Holloway's finger moved to Marcus. "And you, my athletic young friend, seem to have far too much physical energy. Perhaps some surgical modifications to your motor cortex would help you achieve a more peaceful state." Marcus was shaking his head frantically. No. This isn't happening. This isn't real. Reality is what we make it," Dr. Holloway said. Then he looked at Sarah. "And you, my dear. Such emotional turbulence. Such resistance to authority. I think electroshock therapy would be just the thing to help you find your proper place." Sarah let out a sob and grabbed my arm. "Danny, please. We have to get out of here." Finally, Dr. Holloway's attention turned to me. "And you, Daniel. The leader of this little group. The one who brought them all here. I think you deserve something special." He smiled wider, and I could see that his teeth weren't just sharp, they were moving, writhing like tiny snakes in his mouth. "For you, I have a very special procedure in mind. Something I've been perfecting for decades. You see, the human brain is such a fascinating organ. So many neural pathways, so many connections. I've learned how to rearrange them, to create new patterns of thought, new ways of perceiving reality. You're going to turn us into them," I said, gesturing at the children. "Into your puppets." "Puppets is such an ugly word," Dr. Holloway said. "I prefer to think of them as my greatest successes. They found peace, Daniel. Perfect, eternal peace. No more fear, no more pain, no more troubling thoughts or emotions. Just pure, simple existence." The children had pushed us almost to the stage now. I could feel the heat from the spotlight on my face, could see every detail of Dr. Holloway's impossible features. "The procedures are quite painless," he continued. "Well, mostly painless. There's a brief moment of discomfort during the initial incision, but after that, you won't feel anything at all. In fact, you won't feel anything ever again." That's when Sarah broke. She let out a scream that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul, a sound of pure terror and rage. Then she charged forward, pushing through the crowd of children and running straight for the stage. "Sarah, no," I shouted, but she was already climbing onto the platform. Dr. Holloway watched her approach with mild interest, like a scientist observing an interesting specimen. Sarah reached him and started swinging her fists, trying to hit him, trying to hurt him somehow. But her hands passed right through him. "My dear child," Dr. Holloway said, his voice filled with paternal disappointment. "Violence is never the answer. That's exactly the kind of behavior we're here to correct." He reached out with one impossibly long arm and touched Sarah's forehead with a single finger. Sarah's eyes went wide, then rolled back in her head. She collapsed to the stage, her body convulsing violently. "Sarah!" Marcus yelled, trying to push through the children to reach her. But the children were moving faster now, their hands reaching out to grab us. I felt small fingers wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me toward the stage. That's when the lights went out. Not the spotlight on the stage, that remained, casting Dr. Holloway and Sarah's convulsing form in harsh white light. But every other light in the auditorium died, plunging the seats into absolute darkness. In that darkness, something moved. It wasn't the children. They had all frozen in place when the lights went out, their heads tilted at identical angles like they were listening to something. No, this was something else, something bigger. I heard Tyler gasp beside me. "What the fuck is that?" I followed his gaze and saw them. Shapes moving in the darkness between the seats. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to be made of shadow itself. They moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, gliding between the rows of seats like smoke. "The shadow people," Marcus whispered. From the drawing upstairs, Dr. Holloway had noticed them too. For the first time since we'd encountered him, his expression changed. The confident smile faded, replaced by something that might have been fear. "No," he said, his voice losing its calm authority. "Not yet. They're not ready yet." The shadow figures began moving toward the stage, and as they got closer, I could see details that made my mind reel. They weren't quite human. Their limbs were too long, their heads too large, and where their faces should have been were just smooth, featureless surfaces. but somehow I knew they were looking at us. Dr. Holloway stepped away from Sarah's still form. "You don't understand," he called out to the shadows. "The procedures aren't complete. They need more time." The largest of the shadow figures reached the stage and began climbing onto it. As it moved, I could hear it speaking, though its voice didn't come from any visible mouth. Instead, the words seemed to form directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. "The compact is fulfilled," it said. 70 years of service. 70 years of gathering. The debt is paid. But I can give you more." Dr. Holloway protested, backing toward the rear of the stage. "These 4, plus the others who will come. I can expand the program." "The compact is fulfilled," the shadow figure repeated. "Your time has ended." That's when I understood. Dr. Holloway wasn't the one in charge here. He never had been. He was just another servant, another puppet dancing to someone else's tune. The shadow figure reached out with one impossibly long arm and touched Dr. Holloway's chest. The doctor's eyes went wide, his mouth opened in a silent scream, and then he began to dissolve. It wasn't like melting or burning. It was more like he was being erased pixel by pixel until there was nothing left but empty space where he had been standing. As soon as Dr. Holloway disappeared, the children around us began to change. The black oil drained from their eyes, replaced by normal human colors. Their impossible smiles faded, leaving expressions of confusion and fear. "Where are we?" One of them asked, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7. "I want to go home," said another, tears streaming down her face. The shadow figures turned their attention to the children, and I expected them to do the same thing they'd done to Dr. Holloway. But instead, they began to glow with a soft, warm light. "Come," they said, their voices gentle now. "It is time to rest." One by one, the children began to fade away, their forms becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. But they didn't look afraid, they looked peaceful, like they were finally being allowed to sleep after a very long day. Within minutes, all of them were gone, leaving just me, Marcus, Tyler, and Sarah's unconscious form on the stage. The largest shadow figure turned to us, and when it spoke, its voice was filled with something that might have been gratitude. "You have freed them," it said. "The binding is broken. They can rest now." "What about us?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "You were never part of the compact," the figure replied. "You are free to go." "What about Sarah?" Marcus called out, climbing onto the stage to kneel beside her. The shadow figure moved closer to Sarah and touched her forehead with the same gesture Dr. Holloway had used. But instead of convulsing, Sarah's body relaxed, and her breathing became steady and normal. "She will wake soon," the figure said. "But she will remember none of this. It is better that way." "Will she be okay?" I asked. "She will be as she was before," the figure assured me. The doctor's touch left no permanent mark. The shadow figures began to fade, their forms becoming less distinct. "Leave this place," the largest one said. "Do not return. The compact is ended, but the building itself remains hungry." "Wait," I called out. "What were you? What was all of this?" But they were already gone, leaving us alone in the dark auditorium. The spotlight on the stage flickered and went out, plunging us into complete darkness. But a few seconds later, our headlamps came back on, and I could see that everything had changed again. The auditorium was empty and decaying, just like the rest of the building. The stage was bare except for some rotted wooden planks and a few pieces of abandoned equipment. There was no sign that Dr. Holloway or the children had ever been there. Sarah stirred and opened her eyes. "What happened?" she asked groggily. "Where are we?" Marcus helped her sit up. "We're in the Institute. You passed out, but you're okay now." Sarah looked around in confusion. "Institute? What institute?" Then her eyes focused on our surroundings. "Oh my God, we actually did it. We actually got inside the Holloway Institute." She didn't remember anything. Not the children, not Dr. Holloway, not the shadow figures. As far as she knew, we just entered the building, and she'd fainted from nerves. Tyler and Marcus exchanged glances with me. I could see the question in their eyes. Do we tell her? I shook my head slightly. The shadow figure had been right. It was better this way. "Come on," I said, helping Sarah to her feet. "Let's get out of here." We made our way back through the building, and this time, everything was normal. The corridors were empty, The rooms were decaying and abandoned, and there were no sounds except our own footsteps and breathing. The service door opened easily, and within minutes we were standing outside in the rain, breathing the sweet, clean air of the real world. "That was awesome," Sarah said, her excitement returning. "We should definitely come back with better equipment, get some really good photos." "No," I said quickly. "I mean, it was cool, but I think once was enough." Marcus and Tyler nodded in agreement. We'd all heard the shadow figures warning about the building remaining hungry. We walked back to our cars in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Sarah chattered excitedly about what we'd seen, already planning to research the building's history for her next real estate presentation. But the rest of us said nothing. What could we say? That we'd encountered the ghost of a mad doctor who'd been torturing children for decades? That we'd been saved by creatures made of living shadow? That the building itself was some kind of supernatural entity that fed on human suffering? Nobody would believe us. Hell, if Sarah hadn't been there, I wouldn't have believed it myself. As we reached our cars, Marcus grabbed my arm. "Danny," he said quietly, "that really happened, right? All of it." I looked back at the Institute, its dark windows staring down at us like dead eyes. In the distance, I could hear the sound of heavy machinery. The demolition crew would be starting work in a few days. "Yeah," I said, "it really happened." But as I drove home that night, I found myself wondering if it had. The whole thing seemed like a nightmare, too bizarre and terrifying to be real. Maybe Sarah wasn't the only one who'd forgotten. Maybe our minds had just created the whole experience to cope with the trauma of being trapped in that horrible place. Maybe we'd all just gotten lost in the building for a few hours and let our imaginations run wild. I tried to convince myself of that for the rest of the drive home. I was almost successful, until I got to my apartment and found a child's drawing tucked under my windshield wiper. It showed 4 stick figures standing in front of a large building. Above them, in crayon letters, were the words, "Thank you for setting US free." And at the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, "From Jenny, age 8. Jenny." One of the names from the drawings in the Institute. One of Dr. Holloway's victims. I stood there in the parking lot for a long time, staring at the drawing and trying to process what it meant. The shadow figures had said the children were free, that they could rest now. Maybe this was Jenny's way of saying goodbye. Or maybe the building wasn't as empty as we'd thought when we left. I went upstairs to my apartment and tried to get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could see those oil-black eyes and needle-sharp teeth. I could hear the sound of children crying in empty corridors and the scraping of surgical instruments on metal tables. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called Marcus. "Did you find anything strange when you got home?" I asked. "Like what?" "I don't know. Anything unusual." There was a long pause. "Danny, are you okay? You sound paranoid." "I'm fine. Just answer the question." Another pause. "No, everything was normal." "Why?" I looked at the drawing, still sitting on my kitchen table where I'd left it. "No reason. I'll talk to you later." I hung up and stared at the drawing for a long time. Maybe I was going crazy. Maybe the stress of the whole experience had finally gotten to me. Or maybe Jenny wanted to make sure I remembered. I folded the drawing carefully and put it in my wallet. Then I got dressed and drove to the Holloway Institute one more time. The demolition crew was already there, setting up their equipment. In a few hours, the building that had housed so much suffering would be nothing but rubble. I parked across the street and watched as they prepared to tear it down. Part of me felt relief. Once the building was gone, maybe the nightmares would stop. Maybe I could convince myself that none of it had really happened. But another part of me felt sad. Whatever those shadow figures had been, they'd seemed genuinely concerned about the children. They'd called them patients, had spoken of them with something like affection. Maybe destroying the building was the right thing to do. Maybe it would finally put all those tortured souls to rest. Or maybe it would just set them free to wander somewhere else. As I sat there watching, I noticed movement in one of the upper windows. Just for a second, I thought I saw a small figure waving at me. A little girl with pigtails, smiling and waving goodbye. Then the demolition crew fired up their equipment, and the Holloway Institute began to fall. I watched until there was nothing left but a pile of broken concrete and twisted metal. Then I drove home, hoping that would be the end of it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Some things can't be destroyed with bulldozers and wrecking balls. Some things are harder to kill than old buildings and forgotten memories. And some things follow you home.